The face appeared in our living room window at 2:34 a.m. on a Thursday night, and my wife screamed so loud that our neighbors called the police thinking someone was being murdered. The face was pressed against a glass from the outside, pale and bloated and grinning with lips that were pulled back too far to be natural, revealing gums that were black and teeth that were yellow, and a tongue that was licking the window in slow, deliberate strokes. We live on the 17th floor. There is no balcony. There is no ledge. There is nothing outside that window except 200 feet of empty air and the concrete parking lot far below where something with a face like that should have been splattered into paste. But the face was there, pressed against our glass, watching us with eyes that did not blink, and when I grabbed my phone to take a picture, it smiled wider and slowly shook its head no. My wife Sarah was still screaming when I finally managed to turn on the lights, and the face vanished the instant the brightness touched the window. One moment it was there, that impossible grinning horror floating 17 floors above the ground, and the next moment there was nothing but our reflections in the dark glass and the distant lights of the city spread out below us like a map of everything that was supposed to be normal and safe. Sarah collapsed onto the couch, hyperventilating, and I stood at the window, looking out at the empty night sky, trying to convince myself that we had both experienced some kind of shared hallucination, some trick of light and shadow and sleep deprivation that had created an illusion of something that could not possibly exist. The police arrived 20 minutes later and took our statement with expressions that made it clear they thought we were either drunk or crazy or both. They checked the exterior of the building from the ground and found nothing. They checked the roof and found nothing. They checked the hallways and the stairwells and the elevator shafts and found absolutely nothing that could explain what we had seen. The officer who interviewed us suggested that maybe we had seen a balloon or a plastic bag that had blown against the window, and our tired minds had interpreted it as a face. He said the human brain was wired to see faces everywhere, and clouds and toast and random patterns. He said we should get some rest and call them again if anything else unusual happened. Sarah did not sleep that night. She sat on the couch with all the lights on and stared at the window until the sun came up and washed away the darkness that had hidden whatever had been watching us. I tried to comfort her, but she flinched away from my touch, and I understood because I felt the same way, contaminated somehow by what we had witnessed, violated in a way that went beyond physical intrusion. Something had been outside our window on the 17th floor. Something had pressed its face against our glass. Something had looked at us and smiled and shook its head when I tried to document its existence. That was not a balloon. That was not a plastic bag. That was something that knew we were watching and wanted us to know it was watching back. We considered moving immediately, but our lease had 11 months remaining, and breaking it would cost us thousands we did not have. We considered staying with friends or family, but how do you explain to people that you need to leave your apartment because you saw a face in a window 17 floors above the ground? We would sound insane. We would sound like people who had lost their grip on reality and needed professional help rather than a spare bedroom. So we stayed. We bought blackout curtains for every window. We left lights on in every room throughout the night. We tried to pretend that what happened was an isolated incident, a one-time glitch in the fabric of reality that would not repeat itself. The face came back 3 nights later, and this time it brought friends. Sarah woke me at 3:15 a.m. by grabbing my arm so hard her fingernails drew blood. She was pointing at the window where the blackout curtain had somehow been pulled aside, despite being weighted at the bottom to prevent exactly that from happening. Through the gap I could see faces, multiple faces, pressed against the glass in a cluster that should not have been possible. 5 or 6 of them at least, maybe more, all with that same bloated pallor, and those same black gums, and those same unblinking eyes that were fixed on our bed where we lay frozen in terror. They were not identical. That was somehow worse than if they had been copies of the same face. Each one was different shapes and ages and expressions, like a family portrait painted by a madman. There was an old woman with hollow cheeks and hair that floated around her head as if she were under water. There was a child with eyes that were too large and a mouth that was too small, and tears that seemed to be made of something darker than water. There was a man with half his face missing, the exposed muscle and bone glistening weightly in the dim light from the city below. They were all watching us. They were all waiting for something. And as we stared at them in horror, they all began to smile at exactly the same time. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight and pointed it at the window, and the faces scattered like cockroaches fleeing from sudden illumination. They did not disappear instantly this time. I watched them peel away from the glass and drift upward into the darkness above our building. Rising like helium balloons released at a funeral, their faces still turned toward our window, even as they ascended out of sight. The curtain fell back into place, as if an invisible hand had adjusted it. The window was empty once again, but I could not shake the feeling that they had not left, that they were just above us now, floating in the dark sky, waiting for us to turn off the lights and go back to sleep. We did not sleep. We sat in the brightest corner of our apartment with every light blazing and every curtain sealed shut, and we talked about what the hell was happening to us. Sarah thought we should call a priest because what we were seeing could not be explained by science or psychology or any rational framework. I thought we should call a psychiatrist because maybe we were both experiencing some kind of shared psychosis triggered by stress or environmental factors or something in the building's ventilation system. Neither of us wanted to admit what we were both thinking, what we both knew in our bones, even if our minds refused to accept it. The faces were real. The faces were watching us. The faces wanted something from us, and we did not know what it was. I started researching the building the next day, digging through public records and newspaper archives and online forums where people shared stories about haunted locations. What I found made everything worse. Our building had been constructed in 1987 on the site of a previous structure that had burned down in 1984. The fire had killed 19 people, most of them trapped on the upper floors when the stairwells filled with smoke. The bodies had been recovered, but several of them had been burned beyond recognition, and there had been disputes about identification that lasted for years. Some families claimed that their loved ones had never been found, that the official death count was wrong, that there were people who died in that fire whose remains were never located. 17 people were confirmed dead in the fire, and 2 more died later from injuries sustained while trying to escape. 19 total. But the conspiracy theorists online claimed the real number was higher, that there had been undocumented residents living in the building illegally, that there were homeless people who had broken in to escape the cold, that the fire had consumed people who were never reported missing because no one knew they existed. Some accounts put the death toll as high as 30. Some claimed there had been children in the building who were never accounted for, children whose parents had died alongside them, children whose existence was erased by the fire and the subsequent cover-up. I showed Sarah what I had found, and she started crying and did not stop for almost an hour. She said she could not stay in a building where people had burned to death. She said she could feel them now, the ones who had been watching us, the ones who had pressed their faces against our windows 17 floors above the street. She said they were angry, not at us specifically, but at everyone who got to live while they were stuck floating in the darkness outside, forever watching the lives they had been denied. I told her that was not rational. I told her that ghosts were not real. I told her there had to be another explanation. But I did not believe my own words, and she could hear the fear underneath them. The faces came back the next night, and the night after that, and the night after that. They came every night at different times, sometimes one face and sometimes a dozen, sometimes pressing against a window for seconds and sometimes staying for hours. We learned their features. We gave them names. The old woman with the floating hair was Margaret. The child with the 2 large eyes was Timothy. The man with half his face missing was David. We named them because naming them made them less terrifying, made them feel like something we could understand and categorize, and eventually overcome. We were wrong about that. Naming them just made them more real. Sarah started talking to them after the 2nd week. I would wake up in the middle of the night and find her standing at the window with the curtain pulled aside, whispering to the faces that were pressed against the glass. She said they were lonely. She said they had been forgotten. She said they just wanted someone to acknowledge that they had existed, that they had mattered, that their deaths meant something. I told her to stop, told her that engaging with whatever they were would only make things worse, but she looked at me with eyes that had dark circles underneath them and said the faces were not the problem. We were the problem. We were living in their home. We were sleeping in the space where they had burned. We were the intruders. I tried to get her to leave the apartment, to stay somewhere else, even if just for a few nights, but she refused. She said the faces needed her. She said she was the only one who listened to them, the only one who treated them like people instead of monsters. She started spending more time at the window than in bed, more time in darkness than in light. She stopped eating regular meals. She stopped showering. She stopped doing anything except waiting for the faces to appear so she could stand at the glass and whisper to them while they grinned their terrible grins and pressed their bloated features against the barrier that separated our world from whatever hell they inhabited. I woke up alone on the 23rd night since the faces first appeared, and I knew immediately that something was wrong. The apartment was cold, colder than it should have been with the heating running, cold like a window had been left open. I called Sarah's name and received no response. I got out of bed and walked toward the living room, where I could see light flickering, not the steady glow of lamps, but something else, something that pulsed and shifted like flames reflecting off surfaces. Sarah was standing at the window, but the window was open, wide open, letting in the freezing November air, letting in the darkness of the night, letting in the faces that were no longer pressed against glass, but floating freely in our living room. They surrounded her in a ring, their bodies trailing off into wisps of shadow below the waist, Their arms extended toward her in gestures that might have been welcoming or might have been grasping. Sarah was reaching back toward them. Sarah was stepping closer to the open window. Sarah was about to walk out into the empty air 17 floors above the ground. I dragged her out of the apartment and into the hallway, and she fought me the entire way, screaming for the faces, begging them not to leave her. The neighbors came out of their units and stared at us like we were the monsters, like we were the terrifying thing that had invaded their peaceful building. I called an ambulance, and they took Sarah to a psychiatric facility where she was admitted for a 72-hour hold that eventually became a longer stay when she could not stop talking about the people in the window who needed her help. I broke the lease and paid the penalty and moved to a building that was only 3 stories tall with no history of fires or deaths or anything else that might attract whatever had been haunting us. Sarah was released from the hospital after 6 weeks, and she seemed better, seemed like herself again, seemed like the woman I had married before we moved into that cursed apartment on the 17th floor. We never talked about what happened. We never discussed the faces or the whispers or the night I found her about to walk into empty air. We just tried to move forward and rebuild our lives and forget that any of it had ever happened. But Sarah still looks at windows differently now. She still pauses whenever she passes a high-rise building and tilts her head upward like she is looking for something. She still wakes up in the middle of the night sometimes and goes to our window and stands there staring at the glass, even though we are only on the 2nd floor and there is nothing outside except a small courtyard and the back of another building. I ask her what she is looking at, and she says nothing. I ask her if she is okay, and she says fine. But I can see her lips moving sometimes when she stands there, whispering words I cannot hear to faces I cannot see. Last week I noticed something that made my heart stop beating for a full 3 seconds. I was lying in bed, watching Sarah at the window, watching her whisper to the darkness, when I saw condensation forming on the glass. The condensation was not coming from inside our apartment where the air was warm and dry. It was forming on the outside of the glass, in patterns that looked almost like handprints, in shapes that looked almost like fingers pressing against the barrier from the other side. We live on the 2nd floor now. There is a courtyard outside our window, and the ground is only 12 feet below. But I am starting to understand that the height does not matter. The faces followed us. The faces found Sarah again. The faces are pressing against our window every night now, not as visible as they were on the 17th floor, but present, watching, waiting for another opportunity to call her home. I do not know how to save her. I do not know how to stop whatever has attached itself to my wife. I only know that the faces want her, and they are patient, and they have been waiting for almost 40 years to find someone who would listen to them. Sarah listened. Sarah acknowledged them. Sarah gave them a connection to our world that they will not release. I am writing this because I need someone to know what happened to us, what is still happening, what will keep happening until the faces finally get what they want. If you live in a high-rise building and you see something at your window that should not be there, do not look at it. Do not acknowledge it. Do not give it a name or a story or any reason to believe that you can see it. Close your curtains and turn on your lights and pretend that you never saw anything at all. Because once they know you can see them, they never stop watching. And once you start talking to them, they never stop listening. And once you reach toward them, they never stop reaching back, waiting for the moment when the window opens and the barrier falls, and you finally step forward to join them in the darkness where they have been floating since the fire took everything they were and left only hunger and loneliness and those terrible smiling faces pressed against the glass of the living. Sarah is at the window again right now. She is whispering again. The condensation is forming again. And I can hear something that I have never heard before, something that is making me write these final words as quickly as I can before I lose the courage to share them. I can hear them whispering back,